It was announced it was off. The show at the Dick Heavens was canceled. And then a little later, they said it was back on again. I didn't even know what was going on. I was so wiped out, man. It felt like, I don't know, some kind of nervous breakdown or something, a period in music that's happening right this second, and it's only gonna last maybe another month or two. The voice on that old tape is Jimi Hendrix's, not on stage, not in front of a crowd, just speaking, weary and restless, about a ticking clock only he seemed to feel. For decades, the official story said his clock ran out because of a simple overdose. Another rock legend, too much pressure, too many pills, too much wine, case closed. But according to files, interviews, and accounts that surfaced over the years, the paperwork on his death told a different story. A darker one that some people claimed had been quietly buried for more than 50 years. The most famous black guitarist in history did not collapse under stage lights or at some wild Hollywood party. According to reports, he died in a quiet London flat. Lungs reportedly filled with red wine, a room that looked strangely wiped down, and a single witness whose story shifted so many times it stopped sounding like memory and started sounding like a script. When investigators and researchers tried to revisit the case, they said they found crucial evidence missing. Tapes that were once cataloged had supposedly vanished. Certain phone records were said to have been removed, and more than one person connected to that night died before they could ever give a full statement. This wasn't just a tragedy. It fit a pattern that black artists were said to have faced long before Jimi Hendrix and long after his body left that London morgue. Tonight, the file opens again. We walk hour by hour through Jimi Hendrix's last 24 hours and through the disturbing details his autopsy was said to reveal. 1. The pressure before everything cracked. To understand Jimi's final day, you have to rewind just a little to the week when the pressure stopped being background noise and started feeling like something closing in. September 1970. London was cold, damp, and unusually still. Inside that gray city, Jimi Hendrix was living like a man trying to outrun his own reflection. He had left the United States to escape the chaos that came with his fame there. Reporters digging through his private life, court cases and legal threats stacking up, and above all, the suffocating grip of his manager, Mike Jeffrey. Jeffrey wasn't just a manager. People around Hendrix described him like a warden, someone who controlled the shows, the money, and, increasingly, the man. On September 10, 1970, Jimi reportedly told a close friend, "I'm finished with Jeffrey. I'm signing a new contract next week." Walking away would mean Mike Jeffrey stood to lose millions and, more importantly, lose control. Around that same time, Jimi started telling people he felt watched. A neighbor later recalled seeing him at the window at 2 in the morning, pulling the curtain back just a few inches, letting it fall, then doing it again. Not like a man enjoying the night, but like someone checking for shadows. In the studio, a technician remembered Jimi lowering his voice and saying, "Somebody's following me. Somebody wants me gone." It was the kind of line that sounds paranoid until you look at what happened next. Between September 15th and 16th, he canceled 2 shows, blaming exhaustion. He admitted he hadn't slept in 3 nights straight. When he picked up his guitar, his hands were reportedly shaking. This wasn't the loose, explosive Hendrix people knew. It was a man whose nervous system looked like it was running on fumes. According to those around him, it didn't feel like some rock star burnout. It felt like a man walking directly toward danger and fully aware that something was waiting on the other side. 2. The final 24 hours, a reconstructed timeline. The last day of Jimi Hendrix's life begins on the afternoon of September 17th, 1970, at exactly 3 p.m. in the lobby of the Cumberland Hotel near Marble Arch. Witnesses later said the way he moved through that lobby was not the way a superstar usually glides through a hotel. One desk clerk described it simply. He looked scared, like someone trying to get out before something or someone caught up to him. When Jimi pushed through the revolving doors and stepped into the London street, he didn't stop to chat, didn't joke with the staff, didn't even pause to adjust the scarf at his neck. He walked fast, head lowered, scanning the street, the cars, the windows. Not like a celebrity soaking up attention, but like a man making sure he wasn't being followed. By 5:45 p.m., Jimi arrived at the Samarkand Hotel in Notting Hill, where his girlfriend, Monica Danneman, was waiting for him. According to later accounts, a CCTV camera on Lansdowne Crescent captured her white Mercedes pulling up. Witnesses described Monica stepping out first, smiling, almost upbeat. Jimi followed a few seconds later with none of that energy. His hands stayed in his coat pockets, his shoulders slumped. His eyes stayed on the ground. A delivery driver unloading crates across the street later told investigators that Jimi looked like he did not want to walk into that building. Inside Monica's small apartment, she would later insist they spent a calm evening. Tea, talk about upcoming plans, Bob Dylan records spinning softly in the background. A quiet night in. But neighbors in the building said something else entirely. Around 8:30 p.m., residents at the Samarkand reported hearing raised voices from Monica's room. One neighbor, a young woman who worked nights at a cafe, remembered Monica's voice sharp, cutting, while Jimi's sounded exhausted, drained, like someone who no longer had the strength to fight back. Another tenant returning home claimed she clearly heard Jimi say, "I don't want to stay here," not with anger in his tone, but with fear. From the hallway, the lights in their room looked low. The curtains pulled tightly shut. Shadows passed back and forth across the fabric, the kind of restless pacing that suggests an argument going in circles. Later, Monica denied all of this. She kept repeating that they spent the night peacefully. But two independent witnesses described conflict, and neither had anything to gain by inventing it. As the night stretched past midnight, the atmosphere around that apartment became even more unsettling. At roughly 1 a.m. on September 18th, a taxi driver pulling into the rear parking lot noticed a man standing near Monica's white Mercedes. The stranger, according to the driver's statement, was white, late 30s, wearing a long dark coat, smoking, and staring directly at the building's back entrance as if waiting for someone to come out. The driver watched for several minutes. The man didn't move, didn't look around, didn't act lost. Then he flicked his cigarette to the pavement, turned, and disappeared into the narrow side street behind the Samarkand. When police later tried to match this description to any worker, guest, or resident, they reportedly found no one who fit. The man was never identified, and no meaningful investigation into who he was or why he was there was pursued. From here, the timeline fractures. Between roughly 3 and 4 a.m., what happened inside Monica's apartment splits into two competing versions, hers and the one suggested by medical evidence. Monica later claimed that Jimi was still awake, talking softly, jotting down lines of poetry. She said he took only a couple of her prescribed sleeping tablets, nothing extreme. According to her, he lay there breathing normally, resting calmly, even murmuring short sentences as the sky began to lighten. But paramedics and medical examiners who reviewed his condition later painted a very different picture. Based on rigor mortis, stomach contents, and body temperature, doctors estimated that Jimi had almost certainly been dead long before morning. They placed his time of death between about 5 and 7 a.m., hours before anyone picked up a phone to call for help. One paramedic would later be quoted as saying, "He couldn't have been alive at sunrise, not in the condition we found him." This is the fracture line at the center of the mystery. If Jimi was awake and talking when Monica claimed, the physical evidence doesn't fit. And if the medical timeline is correct, then Monica's entire story about those early hours collapses. From 3 to 7 a.m., the official narrative goes dark. Every version offered about those hours has been challenged by someone, either by witnesses, by records, or by the body itself. The next confirmed moment arrives at 11:18 a.m., when an emergency call was finally placed. When paramedics reached the apartment around 11:30, they found Jimi Hendrix lying on his back, fully dressed, arms straight at his sides. His face, one medic later recalled, looked calm, almost arranged. There were no signs of a violent struggle, no overturned furniture, no smashed glass. There was also no vomit on the bed or floor, no puddles or splashes of alcohol, no sticky red stains on the sheets that would match what they were about to find inside his body. According to one paramedic's later account, the moment they began working on him, it became clear this was not a normal overdose. He said there was wine everywhere inside Jimi, his lungs, his stomach. It was like somebody poured it into him, he recalled. The sheets were clean. The pillows were clean. The carpet was clean. Yet Jimi had somehow taken in a quantity of red wine that, by their estimates, would have been almost impossible to swallow willingly without spilling it. Another medic later said in an interview that Jimi hadn't just choked, it was more like he had drowned in it. The implication was terrifying. The wine might not have been simply drunk. It might have been administered. There was something else. The room reportedly smelled faintly of cleaning products, not of a night of heavy drinking. Surfaces looked wiped down. Certain items seemed to have been moved. And no one could point to the bottle or the glasses that should have been there if he'd consumed that much wine. Monica did not ride in the ambulance with him. She stayed behind in the apartment. Within about half an hour, she gave her first version of what happened, a story that would change 2 more times over the next quarter century. By the time investigators tried to reconstruct that last 24-hour window, one conclusion kept appearing in their notes. The official, simple explanation did not hold together. There were too many contradictions between witnesses. Too many dead zones in the timeline. Too many signs that someone might have altered the scene before anyone called for help. A man does not drown in wine without spilling it. A man is not alive at sunrise if rigor mortis has already set in by late morning. A man does not die peacefully in his sleep if neighbors heard an argument just hours earlier. And a timeline cannot be trusted when the only surviving witness keeps changing the story. This is the point where the questions grow darker. This is the point where the evidence starts to thin out and disappear. And this is the point where Jimi Hendrix's last day stops looking like a tragedy and starts looking like a mystery file that was never meant to be fully opened. 3. The autopsy file, the wine that should not have been there. On September 21st, 1970, inside the cold, echoing corridors of Street Mary Abbott's mortuary in West London, the official autopsy on Jimi Hendrix began. The man in charge was the lead examiner, Dr. Robert Donald Terry, a professional who expected to do what everyone assumed he would do, confirm the story the newspapers had already printed. A tragic overdose. Another rock star gone. Nothing more to see. But almost from the first incision, the body on the table began telling a story that did not match the headlines. A story that, according to later accounts, the public would not fully hear for decades. The room was silent except for the faint hum of lights and the occasional clink of metal. Instruments were laid out in precise rows. Overhead lamps burned down on the table like interrogators, exposing every mark, every bruise if there had been any. Because when Dr. Tier examined the body's surface, something immediate stood out. There were no needle marks, no obvious signs of recent violence, no bruises on the arms suggesting restraint, no defensive wounds on the hands, nothing that shouted, "struggle." Inside, the picture was just as strange. The stomach contained only a small amount of sleeping tablets, so little that, for a man of Jimi's size, it was not considered a lethal dose. There was no sign of a catastrophic overdose, no massive internal damage from drugs, no destroyed organs. For a moment, if you looked only at the pills, the death almost seemed quiet. Then the lungs were opened. As they were cut, a dark red liquid reportedly spilled out, far more than anyone would expect to see in a normal case. The same liquid pooled in the stomach, running across the cold steel. It was not blood. It was not the thick, bitter mix of vomit seen in typical overdose cases. It was wine, red wine. Enough of it that, according to people familiar with the report, Dr. Tier physically stepped back, then leaned in again as if he needed to be sure. It was the kind of detail that does not fit inside a simple narrative. Across the hall, the emergency doctor who had tried to revive Jimi, Dr. John Bannister, had already told investigators what he believed he witnessed when paramedics brought Hendrix in. He reportedly described it bluntly. This was not a normal overdose. It was like drowning in wine, he said. That one sentence from a man who had seen thousands of emergencies punched a hole straight through the official version of events. Because drowning in wine raises a question no one in authority seemed eager to answer. How does a man drown without water? And how does he drown in wine inside a bedroom where no one finds so much as a puddle? Dr. Tier's report confirmed the same unsettling contrast. The clothes were clean, the chest was clean, the hair was clean, the bedding was clean. And yet, In the place where air should have been inside the lungs, there was wine. Wine does not slip into the lungs through normal, casual drinking. Wine does not flood the trachea unless a person is already unconscious or unless the liquid is forced past the body's natural defenses. At this point, the autopsy stopped feeling like a routine medical examination and began to look disturbingly like a crime scene laid out on a slab. The morgue assistants taking notes that day reportedly remembered how heavy the silence became. No one knew how to reconcile the spotless environment with the drowning-like evidence coming out of Jimmy's body. There was no vomit on the pillow, no splash marks on the sheets, no streaks running from the mouth or nose, no stains that could match the volume found in his lungs and stomach. For a few long moments, the doctors simply looked at one another, thinking through what the body was telling them. The place Jimmy was found did not match the way he died. From there, the questions turned sharper. If Jimmy had somehow drunk enough wine to flood his lungs, why wasn't it everywhere? If he had been so far gone that his body could no longer swallow properly, why didn't he choke and convulse the way overdose victims typically do? And if he was already unconscious, who was handling the bottle? Who tilted his head? Was anything held over his mouth? Were there one or more people present? According to those who later examined the notes, a small but crucial detail appeared. The mixture of wine and stomach fluids had settled in a way that reflected gravity, indicating the liquid entered his system while he was lying flat on his back. But when medics arrived, his body position did not completely align with that orientation. The angle of the liquid inside the lungs did not match the angle of the body as it was reported at the scene. In forensic work, tiny inconsistencies like that are rarely meaningless. They often point to movement, staging, or intervention. That left two options. Either the body had been moved after death, or the liquid had been introduced at a time and in a manner that didn't fit any ordinary accident. Neither option pointed toward a simple overdose. Both pointed toward something far more troubling. Meanwhile, Dr. Bannister added another vivid detail in later interviews. When he tried to clear Jimmy's airway, he said the wine just kept coming, as though someone had filled him up. The suction machine, a device designed for serious medical crises, struggled to cope with the volume coming from Jimmy's throat and lungs. One ambulance man, Reg Jones, later described it in a way that stuck with listeners. It was as if the inside of Hendrix was soaked, but the outside was not. A contradiction so obvious that it practically advertised manipulation. The autopsy notes also indicated there was no strong smell of alcohol coming from his hair or skin. Only faint traces lingered around his mouth. And even more oddly, despite the massive amount of wine inside his body, Jimmy was not extremely intoxicated by blood standards. His blood alcohol level did not match a typical drowning in alcohol scenario. That meant the wine had not circulated through his bloodstream in any normal way. It had entered his body shortly before death, or at the very moment of death, too late to spread. This is the point where, in a different format, an investigator might freeze the frame and ask, does this really resemble an accident? Or does it look like someone wanted the scene to tell a story that the body refuses to support? Then there is the detail most people never hear in the clean, reduced version of the case. The autopsy did not aggressively chase the possibility of homicide. The official cause of death was recorded as inhalation of vomit after barbiturate intoxication. But even the examiner later acknowledged that the barbiturate levels were only mild, far from a classic fatal overdose. And the vomit referenced in that explanation, according to later re-examinations, was primarily wine. The stomach contents revealed something else chilling. Jimmy appeared not to have eaten for many hours. No dinner, no snacks, nothing that matched the story of a cozy night in with tea and food. Monica would later say they had tea and sandwiches. The body suggested otherwise. Buried in the official language was one understated line that, in hindsight, stands out more than almost anything else. Death occurred in circumstances that are unclear. This is where, in a documentary, the narrator's tone would shift. The autopsy didn't simply support the official story, it quietly undermined it. Nothing in that examination lined up neatly with a classic overdose. Nothing suggested a peaceful, solitary passing. And nothing fully matched the narrative Monica repeated in later years. Instead, The evidence pointed in a direction that the report itself did not dare to spell out. Jimi Hendrix's death appeared to require another person's presence, whether that person acted in panic, in carelessness, under pressure, or with intent. The autopsy could not name them, but it did strongly suggest one thing. Jimi Hendrix did not simply drink himself to death. Something or someone put that wine where it was never supposed to be. From that moment on, the central question shifted. It was no longer just what happened in that room. It became, who else was in that room, and why has the full truth never been allowed into the light? 5. The witness, the woman who kept rewriting the night. To step into the darkest part of Jimi Hendrix's final hours, you have to follow the only person who claimed to be with him during those critical moments. Monica Dannemann. From the second her name enters the story, everything around his death becomes foggy, tangled, and disturbingly convenient. Timelines drift, details bend, and each time a new question appears, her version seems to shift just enough to survive it. The official record of her changing story begins on the late morning and early afternoon of September 18, 1970. Police first questioned her inside her small room at the Samarkand Hotel at approximately 1:45 p.m. Officers who later spoke about that interview recalled a woman who seemed calm, almost composed. She poured tea. She sat upright. Her voice was steady, not hysterical. To them, she did not look like someone who had just watched a lover die in the same building. Her first account was simple, clean, and easy to file away. She said Jimi had been tired. He had taken 1 or 2 of her prescribed sleeping tablets. He lay down. He slept. She claimed he was quiet and peaceful when she last saw him alive, like a man finally getting rest. In that first version, there was no panic, no mention of arguments, no mention of fear, no mention of wine. It sounded exactly like what the authorities and the press were prepared to hear. A tragic, sleepy accident. Nothing more. But that smooth first story began to tear almost immediately. Within 48 hours, reporters were clustered outside the Samarkand, waiting. By then, the police interview was over, but the headlines were just beginning. When Monica stepped in front of the media, her tone and details were suddenly different. This time, her voice shook. She described a frightened, restless Jimi who couldn't sleep at all. She claimed he swallowed 9 Vesperax tablets, a powerful dose that would drop most adults for an entire day. She painted a picture of him tossing and turning, gasping, sweating, then eventually lying still in a way that terrified her. The newspapers printed it in bold type, Jimi Hendrix killed by sleeping pills, an overdose. A sad, cautionary story. But when toxicology results came back, the numbers reportedly did not come close to supporting that second version. The amount of sleeping medication in his body was described as mild present, but nowhere near the towering dose she had just told the world. That was when investigators and researchers realized something chilling. Monica wasn't simply remembering, she was revising. By the middle of October 1970, as she faced questions about the contradictions, Monica adjusted her account yet again. Version 3. Now she insisted that Jimi hadn't taken any alcohol that night. No wine, no heavy drinking. She denied seeing him with wine at all. She explained the tidy apartment by saying she liked to clean in the morning. She said she had been in shock, too overwhelmed to think clearly. When confronted with phone records that suggested a call had been placed earlier than the official 11:18 a.m. emergency call, a call she said she never made, she reportedly answered with a flat, almost mechanical phrase, "I don't remember." But the scene the paramedics described did not match any of those versions. The emergency crew who entered the apartment around 11:30 a.m. later said that the room looked as though someone had been carefully managing it. Pill bottles seemed to have been moved. Ashtrays were emptied. Clothes were folded. Surfaces looked wiped down. One of them commented that it did not resemble the chaotic room of a woman who had just watched her boyfriend stop breathing. One medic, speaking decades later, put it bluntly, it looked staged. Even more disturbing was how Monica herself appeared to them. By their account, she was not screaming, not shaking, not barely able to stand. Instead, she seemed controlled, measured, almost rehearsed. One of them said she appeared less like a devastated partner and more like someone guarding a narrative. "She didn't look like someone who had just lost the love of her life," he said. "She looked like someone protecting a story." Then another piece of the puzzle surfaced, and it was the kind of detail that investigative files circle in red. Monica was known to keep a personal journal. Friends said she wrote everything down: arguments, sketches, outfits, plans, and passing thoughts. The journal should have been a window into those last days. But the pages covering September 17th and 18th were missing. Not smudged or accidentally torn, cleanly removed, as if someone had carefully lifted them out. When a German interviewer asked her about this years later, observers noticed a visible change. Her body tensed, her jaw clenched, her voice turned defensive as she snapped, "I threw them away." She offered no further explanation. The questions didn't stop there. A neighbor at the Samarkand later recalled seeing Monica outside very early that morning before the ambulance arrived. She was reportedly wiping the windshield of her Mercedes, chain-smoking, glancing around the lot as if she expected someone. Not the behavior most people imagine from a woman in shock. Another resident claimed to have seen her carrying something that looked like a bundled bedsheet toward the building's dumpsters at dawn. No one checked those dumpsters in time. By the time investigators thought to ask, whatever had been inside them was long gone. As the years went on, Monica shaped a public image around her role in Hendrix's final day. She presented herself as the devoted last companion, the woman who tried to save him, who understood him, who held his memory close. She wrote letters to magazines. She shared drawings of Jimi. She gave interviews about their special bond. But people who knew her privately painted a more complicated portrait. Some described jealousy that flared quickly. Others talked about obsession and what they saw as an intense, sometimes unsettling possessiveness. A few claimed that Monica used those final hours as a kind of shield, almost a weapon to keep herself permanently attached to his legend. Then came the final twist in her story, one that turned her from a living, conflicting witness into a permanent question mark. On April 5th, 1996, nearly 26 years after Jimi's death, Monica Dannemann was found dead inside her Mercedes-Benz, parked near a wooded area close to her home in Seaford, England. The engine was off, the doors were unlocked, she was slumped in the driver's seat. Authorities ruled it a suicide, with carbon monoxide poisoning cited as the cause. But friends and acquaintances were adamant that this did not make sense. Some of them said she was terrified of cars and enclosed spaces. They insisted she would never choose that particular method. According to people close to her, she had been visibly on edge in the days before she died, pacing, mumbling about lawsuits, statements, and people coming after her. She had recently lost a legal case to Kathy Etchingham, one of Jimi's former girlfriends, which forced her to retract serious claims she had been making for years. Some believed that legal defeat pushed her over the edge. Others whispered that something, or someone, might have helped push. Then came the detail that has haunted researchers ever since. It was reported that Monica died one day after a phone conversation with a Hendrix researcher during which she allegedly hinted that the truth about Jimi's death was not what the public believed. She supposedly said there were things she had never revealed, things she might finally be ready to discuss. The follow-up conversation never happened. With her death, the last direct link to those missing hours between 3 and 7 a.m. was gone. The only person who could have fully explained the contradictions, the arguments, the timeline, the wine, the cleaned room, the delayed call, took those answers with her. Today, when investigators, authors, and researchers revisit the Hendrix case, many of them arrive at the same uneasy conclusion. Every version Monica ever gave clashes with something solid. Her first story contradicts her second contradicts her third, and all of them contradict the autopsy, the paramedic reports, and the physical timing of death, which leaves one bitterly simple truth at the center of all her contradictions. Monica Dannemann knew more than she ever admitted, and whatever unfolded in that small room between 3 and 7 a.m., she wasn't just a distant observer. Whether willingly or not, she was woven into the story itself. 6. The motive. Who benefited when he stopped breathing? When investigators and serious researchers go back over the last months of Jimi Hendrix's life, one name keeps surfacing like a watermark running through every page of the file: his manager, Michael "Mike" Jeffrey. The closer you get to Jeffrey's role, the more the question shifts. It stops being, "How did Jimi die?" and becomes, "Who had the most to gain if he didn't live to sign his next contract?" To see the motive clearly, you have to rewind to early 1970, when Jimi was quietly preparing to break away from Jeffrey's control. For years, Jeffrey had operated like a man who treated business as battlefield. He was heavily in debt, tangled with questionable backers, rumored to have intelligence connections, and known for running his management like a military unit, strict, secretive, and unrelenting. Bandmates remembered him pacing backstage with a drink in his hand, muttering about money, contracts, and how to keep Hendrix locked in. He wasn't just worried about the music, he was worried about losing his hold on the person generating it. By May 1970, Jimi had started telling close friends that he'd had enough. Enough missing money, enough forced tours, enough decisions made without him, but in his name. One friend recalled Jimi saying, "I feel like I'm working to pay somebody else's debts. This isn't my life anymore." Another remembered a more chilling moment: Jeffrey grabbing Jimi's arm during a heated argument and hissing, "You belong to me." Jimi pulled away, shaken. The words stuck. Behind the scenes, Jimi had begun moving toward a new management team. Paperwork was being drawn up, papers that, once signed, would have cut Jeffrey almost completely out of his future. No more control of touring, no more control of the business, no more control of the catalog. Those contract changes were reportedly scheduled to take effect within days of Jimi's death. If Jimi lived long enough to sign them, Jeffrey would lose his biggest asset and the backbone of his entire empire. And that empire was crumbling. By late summer 1970, Jeffrey's financial problems were not just whispers. They were pressure points. He was said to be drowning in debt, his casino ventures failing, his club business bleeding cash. People he had borrowed from wanted their money back. Some of them, according to various accounts, were not the sort you disappoint twice. Jimi leaving wasn't just a bad quarter or a lost client. For Jeffrey, it looked like a financial death sentence. Then another detail surfaced in later research, one that raised every possible red flag. Jeffrey had reportedly taken out a massive life insurance policy on Jimi Hendrix, around $2 million at the time, worth many times that today. The policy paid out in the event of Jimi's death. And, according to some accounts, Jimi never fully understood what had been done in his name. On September 18, 1970, Jimi Hendrix died. Within 48 hours, Jeffrey was said to be pursuing the insurance payout. Within a week, he had secured full control over Hendrix's entire catalog, control that would have slipped out of his hands if Jimi had lived to shift his management. And, almost just as quickly, Jeffrey was gone from London. He told the press he was grieving, but according to former employees, he left so abruptly he abandoned his office keys on the desk. One assistant remembered him spending the days after Jimi's death behind closed doors, surrounded by paperwork, shredding some documents, locking others into briefcases, and making urgent phone calls deep into the night. Then he vanished into movement: Spain, Mallorca, the Caribbean, anywhere but the city where Jimi had died. It was around this time that rumors about Jeffrey's past began to circle more intensely. Years earlier, he had served in the British Army and reportedly worked with MI5. Some people believed he still knew how to make problems disappear. Others suspected he used old contacts to shield his business dealings. A few speculated that he used intimidation and surveillance to control the artists on his roster. Nothing in that world was ever fully proven, but the whispers never stopped. Meanwhile, in the background of Jimi's life, another layer of pressure existed. Buried in U.S. archives, later researchers pointed to FBI documents showing that Hendrix had been monitored in 1969, 1970. The interest wasn't because he was violent, it was because he was visible. A black cultural icon speaking out against the Vietnam War, supporting the Black Panthers, and criticizing racial injustice was enough to put him on certain lists. According to some who knew him, Jimi started to feel it. One confidant recalled him saying, "Man, They know where I'm going before I get there." Another remembered him muttering that he felt watched all the time, without knowing exactly by whom. Set that against Jeffrey's paranoia, his debts, and his desperate need for control, and the picture becomes more than just a business dispute. It becomes a pressure cooker. Then, 3 years after Jimmy's death, the story took another violent turn. In February 1973, Mike Jeffrey died in a plane crash off the coast of Nantes, France. The timing was inconvenient for more than one reason. He had been scheduled to testify in a legal dispute over Hendrix's estate, a case that might have forced him to reveal financial records, contract details, and management tactics that had been buried since the late 60s. Instead, he boarded a commercial flight to Spain that never made it. The official story said the crash was caused by fog and navigational issues. But gaps remained. Documents missing, a less than complete investigation, and reports of passengers who were never fully accounted for. Jeffrey's body was never recovered. With his disappearance into the sea, many of the financial questions surrounding Hendrix's career sank with him. Files went missing, trails went cold, people stopped talking. When investigators and writers revisited the timeline years later, they kept coming back to a handful of disturbing points. The first was timing. Jimi Hendrix had a new management contract ready, the one that would finally remove Mike Jeffrey from his future. It was supposed to take effect the week after Jimmy died. The second was speed. Jeffrey moved quickly to claim the insurance money. There was no drawn-out battle, no serious pushback from insurers. A multi-million-dollar payout landed in his hands with almost no resistance. The third was control. The Hendrix catalog, one of the most valuable bodies of recorded music on the planet, slid under Jeffrey's full control as soon as Jimmy was gone. And as researchers studied the pattern, one thing became brutally obvious. Jeffrey was the single person who had everything to lose if Jimmy walked away, and everything to gain if he did not live long enough to leave. Perhaps the most unsettling realization was also the simplest. All the financial storms that had been crashing down on Mike Jeffrey debts, lawsuits, pressure from investors seemed to clear after Jimmy's death. The money flowed. The catalog was secure. The insurance had paid. It was as if the exact moment Jimi Hendrix took his last breath, the walls closing in on Mike Jeffrey suddenly stopped moving. That's why, sooner or later, every serious Hendrix researcher finds themselves staring at the same ruthless question. Was Jimi Hendrix, at that moment in time, worth more to Mike Jeffrey dead than alive? The motive, the money, the timing, the fear, the surveillance, the sudden fortune. Together they point toward an uncomfortable reality. Jimi Hendrix's death was not only tragic, it was profitable. And whenever death becomes profit, suspicion is no longer optional. It is mandatory. By the time anyone tried to fully map the finances and the legal maneuvers, Jeffrey was already gone. The evidence was scattered across borders, across companies, across decades. Many of the people who might have known the full story were either silent or dead. But one thing remained, carved into the center of the Hendrix file. Every road that leads toward his final days passes directly through Mike Jeffrey. His debts, his threats, his management, his insurance policy, his sudden disappearance, his sudden escape from ruin. Which brings the story to its most disturbing fork yet. If Jimi Hendrix had lived just one more week long enough to sign that new contract, who would have lost everything? 7. The theories they don't want you asking about. Once all the fragments of Jimi Hendrix's final hours are spread across the table, the autopsy, the witnesses, the money, the missing evidence, the official story doesn't simply wobble, it cracks. And out of those cracks come the theories that have followed his name for more than half a century. The first theory grew directly out of what the paramedics and doctors said they saw that morning. They were the ones who described the impossible volume of wine in his lungs and throat. The way it poured out, as if it had been put there, not swallowed. One of them reportedly said it looked like someone had filled him like a bottle. From that single observation came a brutal idea, that Jimmy may have been given alcohol while unconscious, not sipping it, not casually drinking, but having it forced or allowed into his airway in a way consistent with suffocation rather than a normal overdose. It is a disturbing scenario, one that many people shy away from saying out loud. But it is also one of the only explanations that fits the medical details without bending them. Then there is the theory centered on his manager, Mike Jeffrey. Friends, bandmates, and confidants described a growing war between Jimi and Jeffrey in those last months. They remembered Jeffrey shouting, threatening, reminding Jimi he belonged to him. They remembered Jimi pacing, nervous, talking about firing his manager, taking legal control of his career, and finally owning the rights to his own music. They also remembered the timing. The new contract that would cut Jeffrey out was supposed to be signed just days after Jimi's death. At the same time, Jeffrey's debts were mounting, his investments failing, and his entire financial life seemed to be leaning on Hendrix's success. So when he collected a large insurance payout in the aftermath and disappeared from London within days of the funeral, some people said it felt less like coincidence and more like convenience. Another theory is the one the public was fed first, the official version. Newspapers printed it as fact. Jimi died from a mix of sleeping pills and wine, a tragic miscalculation fueled by stress and exhaustion. But the deeper investigators looked, the more that neat explanation fell apart. The toxicology report did not match a massive overdose. The wine in the lungs did not fit a simple choking episode. The timeline did not support the idea of a quiet, peaceful, early morning death. The official story was simple, clean, and easy to repeat. The evidence, on the other hand, was not. Then there is the staged room theory. Paramedics said the apartment looked too organized, too tidy, clothes folded, ashtrays cleared, surfaces wiped. No vomit on the bed, no spilled wine, no chaos. It looked less like the aftermath of a sudden medical emergency and more like a room someone had prepared to be seen. That led some researchers to wonder whether the scene had been partially cleaned or rearranged before help was called, whether the goal was to erase signs of what really took place and replace them with a narrative that would be easier to explain away. If that is true, the next questions are obvious. What exactly was removed? What was wiped up? And who was being protected? Another, quieter theory focuses on what Jimi might have known about his own finances. People close to him claimed that, in his final months, he had begun looking more closely at contracts and accounts. He allegedly believed that money had vanished, that he had been cheated, that someone had been treating his earnings like their own. He reportedly told friends he had proof and was prepared to go to court. If that is accurate, then his death silenced more than a musician. It may have locked away whatever he was prepared to reveal about the business built on his talent. Then there is perhaps the most tragic interpretation of Monica Dannemann's role not as a mastermind, but as a manipulated piece on someone else's board. Friends described her as emotionally fragile, easily influenced, deeply insecure. According to some, it would not have been difficult for a stronger personality to pressure her, frighten her, or coach her into repeating a version of events that didn't fully belong to her. Her changing stories, the missing diary pages, her contradictions,